Good morning, everyone. My name is George Shackelford. I'm Deputy Director of the Kimball Art Museum, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you this morning to the inaugural program for Modern Art and Politics in Germany, 1910-1945, Masterworks from the Neue Nationalgalerie, Berlin. This is an exhibition that has its origins in a show organized by the Neue Nationalgalerie in 2021 to 2024, showcasing the highlights of their permanent collection that dealt with this incredible period in German history between the end of the empire of Kaiser Wilhelm II, the Weimar Republic that followed, the rise of National Socialism and Adolf Hitler, the Holocaust, and World War II. And I forgot to mention World War I, which about more than, hardly anything could be more important than that. This is an exhibition which is the result of many hardworking people, including all of our colleagues in Berlin, Dieter Schultz, who was the former curator at the Neue Nationalgalerie, Irina Hebert-Grun, who followed Dieter on this project, Joachim Jäger, whom you're going to hear from in just a moment, Klaus Biesenbach, the director of the museum there, who unfortunately is not with us here today, and then our colleagues at the Museum Box, the company that brought this exhibition together logistically and has done such a marvelous job in helping us bring it to the United States. An exhibition like this is impossible without the incredibly talented team of the Kimball Art Museum. From Eric Lee, our director, who unfortunately cannot be here today, he's attending a memorial service for a dear friend that's happening today, to all of my colleagues in the senior staff of the museum, and down to everyone, or including everyone who has a role in making a project like this happen. Our preparation staff, our registrars, our lighting designers, the guards who guard the exhibition, the maintenance staff who make sure that the galleries are in tip-top shape every day. Without them, it is impossible. We are also incredibly grateful to our partners in this exhibition, our local partners who offer us promotional support: American Airlines, the Fort Worth Report, and NBC5. And perhaps above all, in terms of our gratitude to someone outside the Kimball, our gratitude goes to the Federal Council on the Arts and Humanities, which offered us an indemnity which saves us hundreds of thousands of dollars in insurance premiums by the federal government of the United States agreeing to indemnify the exhibition instead of us purchasing commercial insurance for it. We hope that this program will last for a very long time. But now to introduce this exhibition. The Nationalgalerie in Berlin, you see here the great building built at the end of the 19th century for the presentation of modern German art, of the 19th century, the contemporary art of its time as it was inaugurated by the Kaiser. The Kronprinzenpalais, the Crown Prince's Palace, which after World War I served as an annex of the Museum for Contemporary Art, and you'll hear more about this, as I feel sure, as the time goes on today. And the Neue Nationalgalerie, inaugurated in 1968 in this magnificent building by the German architect Mies van der Rohe, who by the 1930s had immigrated to the United States and was operating from Chicago when he built this magnificent building in Berlin, not far from the division line between East and West Berlin when the building was inaugurated in 1968. In this exhibition, you're going to see works by artists who are incredibly famous: Ernst Ludwig Kirchner, Christian Schad with his fantastic Sonia, the poster girl for our exhibition. Otto Dix with his portrait of Alfred Flechtheim, which is going to be the subject of one of our lectures this morning. George Gross with his Pillars of Society. You see it behind him in his studio, and as you'll see it on the wall upstairs in the galleries. And Max Beckmann, another one of our subjects for today, the great German painter who leaves Germany in 1937 and ends up in St. Louis in 1947. But you'll also see works by artists that I suspect you will never have heard of before. One of them is Renée Sentinis, this marvelously modern woman in Berlin whose self-portrait is a very moving and beautiful work in the exhibition. Hannah Höch, best known perhaps for her collages and Dada work, but also a wonderful painter whose picture, The Mosquito is Dead, is a mix of abstraction and surrealism. An artist that I have only discovered for the first time working on this project, Georg Müche, whose name I should have known many, many years ago, but whose magnificent painting, a picture with a grid in the middle, you will see in the exhibition upstairs from 1919. Or Rudolf Belling, again, an artist I knew almost nothing about, whose brass head you see here. It's in the exhibition upstairs. There you see him making it. There you see it at the far right, the very far right edge of this photograph of a display in the Crown Prince's Palace, the Annex Museum of Contemporary Art in the 1920s. Here you see it on loan to the Museum of Modern Art in New York in 1931 for a major exhibition about modern German art held at that 2-year-old museum in 1931. And here you see it in 1937, just, I'm not sure I can make a pointer, but just there, being not admired by Adolf Hitler and Joseph Goebbels in the famous exhibition Entartete Kunst, Degenerate Art, held in Munich in 1937. You'll discover also works by artists, again, that I had never heard of, and one of them is named Horst Strempel. And Horst Strempel is the author of this magnificent painting, Night Over Germany, painted in 1945 and 46 in the immediate aftermath of the war, a painting that he could not have painted before the end of the war for fear of his own life, which deals with the horrifying subject of the concentration camps. And I urge you to spend time looking at it. It is a masterpiece that deserves to be in the canon of great German paintings of the 20th century. And here it is as we have it on display upstairs. So we thank our colleagues at the Neue Nationalgalerie in Berlin for their incredible cooperation in making this exhibition happen. And I am delighted to be able to introduce the first of our speakers this morning, who is Joachim Jäger, who is Deputy Director of the National Gallery, the Neue Nationalgalerie, and responsible for the collections in that institution. Joachim grew up in Munich, and he's the author of a doctoral dissertation on the American painter Robert Rauschenberg. He joined the staff of the Neue Nationalgalerie in 2008, and in 2011 was named deputy director. Among his major responsibilities at the museum are the planning for the expansion of the museum's iconic Mies van der Rohe 1968 pavilion, with an extension devoted to classic modernism to be designed by the Swiss architects Herzog and de Meuron. In spite of his many administrative responsibilities, he still finds time to be a curator, organizing such projects as William Kentridge, Journey to the Moon, Wolfgang Tillmann's Lighter, Divided Heaven, Art Between 1945 and 1968, and Stella and Calatrava, the Michael Kohlhaas collection in 2011, Otto Pena, More Sky in 2014, Ernst Ludwig Kirchner, Hieroglyphs in 2016, and Pablo Picasso and Thomas Scheibitz, Signs, Stage, Lexicon in 2019. With his former colleague, Dieter Schultz, Joachim was responsible for envisioning sharing their 2021 exhibition on art and society with a broader public. And with his current colleague, Irina Herbert-Grun, whom I mentioned earlier, curator at the Neue Nationalgalerie, Joachim served as one of the editors for the handsome exhibition catalog produced by the Kimball for this exhibition. Unfortunately stuck in traffic, but will be delivered to us and available to you for purchase here at the museum on Wednesday. It really does exist. You can see a copy of it in the exhibition. There is nobody better than Joachim to introduce the great museum whose collections are celebrated in modern art and politics in Germany. So will you welcome, please, Joachim Jäger.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Joachim Jäger, as George Shackelford just said. Thank you, George, for this very nice introduction and for the invitation to speak here. It's really a great honor to be here with you, and it's also a great honor to be allowed to speak on the occasion of the exhibition. And I'd also want to thank everybody who was involved in this exhibition, who was planning this exhibition, the directors, George Shackelford as a curator, also our curators, Dieter Scholz and Irina Herbert-Grun, who is here, as we heard already, and the whole team here, the wonderful team at the Kimball Art Museum who made this exhibition possible. And I also want to thank Museumsbox, who helped us to organize this exhibition. So thank you all. It was such a pleasure to working with you here, and the exhibition looks splendid. Thank you, George. You did a wonderful job. It's really worth seeing. Thank you. I'm going to talk a little bit about our collection, and I will start with my first image. No, that's the wrong direction. That's the right direction. Let me see. No.
On the left.
Okay. No. That's it. Yeah, that's my first image. Sorry. The exhibition allows us to look back on the first half of the 20th century, on a turbulent historic period in Germany and in Europe. It was an era characterized by extreme contrasts and opposites, both in art and in society. On the one hand, this period marked the dawn of modernity, a movement associated with great splendor and hope. Innovations such as the automobile and airplane, the telephone and radio, even the subway, led to radical changes in everyday life, especially in cities. The painting by Oskar Nerlinger, here on the left side, illustrates this modern move, this tremendous awakening at the beginning of the 20th century. On the other hand, the turbulent years from 1910 to 1945 were also marked by grave social and political crises, ideological disputes and exclusion, which often led to violent conflicts and ultimately to the catastrophe of the Second World War. George Gross, the great German painter, foresaw a lot of it already in his painting Pillars of the Society, painted in 1926, here on the right side. He is focusing on the political crisis, on corruption, on the abuse of power. In the background, you see Germany already burning 13 years before World War II really began. So with this exhibition here, we focus on the ups and downs of modernism, on the bright and hopeful years, but also on the setbacks, on the declines and exclusions, on the dark times of this period. So what I'd like to explain within the next 15 to 20 minutes is that modern art and society, modern art and politics, which is the title of this show, is not only an exhibition title. This bridge between art and society, art and politics, is something that really characterizes our collection and, in a larger sense, also our everyday-like work in the museum. To give you an understanding why it is like that, we have to go back to the year 1937. Let's see whether it's now working. No. This one. In 1937, and we already saw another image, the National Socialists, with Adolf Hitler as their leader and dictator, made an extreme decision to ban modern art entirely, to exclude every kind of modernism from society. With this exhibition here, entitled Entartete Kunst, Degenerate Art, Opened in 1937 in Munich, the National Socialists suggested that modern art was an error, was wrong, was created by mad people, that modern art was useless and destructive. In the same year, the National Socialists forced all museums in Germany to give away their works of Picasso, Klee, Beckmann, Kandinsky, and so forth. More than 500 works they took away from the National Gallery in Berlin. They sold them and also destroyed a lot of them. So in 1945, when this horrible time was over, when the museums wanted to start anew, they had a big problem. Modern art was no longer there. There was no single work in the collections. Everything had to be recollected, to be reacquired. So everything, every work you see here in this exhibition was repurchased between 1945 and the present day. So we, today's curators, can only look back with great admiration at the post-war generation in Germany who accomplished this magnificent reconstruction of the collection. I will learn it over the time. So here you have the Neue Nationalgalerie in another image. The building designed, we heard before, by Mies van der Rohe and opened in 1968. That is the building which is today dedicated to modern art in Berlin, the art of the 20th century. That is the building where all works you see here in this exhibition were sent to you. But the Mies building is not our only building today, and it is also not our original building for the National Gallery. So to give you the full picture, we have to go a few steps even further back to that building. The history of our institution started in the late 19th century on the Museum Island, an island in the Spree River located right in the center of Berlin. The National Gallery was founded there within a greater architectural setting, designed, as you see, as a huge temple expressing by it leadership, power, authority. What is special and almost unique about this National Gallery is that the museum was founded for contemporary art. Usually, national galleries, when opened in the 19th century, were dedicated to old masters, to art from the ancient or medieval times. But here, in Berlin, the national mission was different. A major donation by a German banker brought a strong focus on contemporary 19th century art. Art by Caspar David Friedrich, or Friedrich Menzel, or Peter von Cornelius, of whom you see here large paintings in a Petersburg hanging. So the National Gallery started off as a house for young German art. Then around 1900, a big move was made by a new director to include French Impressionism. The conservatives in the country were shocked and protesting. French art shouldn't have a place here, they said, in a national museum. But to show French paintings within the context of German art at the same time was a tremendous success, and still is. You see here the main gallery space in an image from 1900. The same gallery with more or less the same works still exists until today and is very popular. It is one of our most famous spaces in Berlin. In the 1920s, and with this move, we are now getting closer to the subject of this exhibition here. Another important director named Ludwig Justi opened a so-called modern section of the National Gallery in another building in the Kronprinzenpalais. This was located even more downtown, located directly at the main boulevard of Berlin. Here, in the second floor, the new director presented works by Klee, Beckmann, Kirchner, Mark, Kandinsky, and others. So all of them at that time truly contemporary artists, artists who were still very much in discussion. The director called it the Gallery of the Living. This museum idea was completely new at that time. Almost nobody back in the 1920s was showing young living artists in a museum. Also, Ludwig Justi was showing these works, as you can see very well in this photo, in a very puristic hanging in front of white neutral walls. Alfred, the later founding director of the Museum of Modern Art in New York, saw this museum and this presentation, and later recalled that the visit had deeply inspired him and helped him developing the later MoMA in New York. So Berlin, the National Gallery, for a short moment, became a role model for others in the world. But this avant-garde role of Berlin, as I mentioned earlier, did not last very long. When the National Socialists came into power in 1933, they stopped the program of the Gallery of the Living immediately. The very last Max Beckmann show was allowed to open, then afterwards all modern or contemporary art was banned. After 1937, after the horrible campaign Degenerate Art, modernism practically became invisible in Nazi Germany. And that explains why the Germans, after the Second World War, were so hungry for modern art, were so motivated to bring exhibitions together, to recollect, to re-exhibit works by Picasso, Klee, Beckmann, Kandinsky, to name just a few. Here you see an important early post-war exhibition in Kassel, a city in center Germany, where modernism was widely exhibited, still very much in a somehow improvised manner, because many buildings were destroyed and there was also not much money available for exhibitions at that time. But many, many visitors came to see modernism again, to see modern art again, and especially these early exhibitions after the Second World War in Germany became legendary. These early years in Europe after the Second World War, however, as you all know, had not been easy either. The Cold War began very soon. East Berlin and West Berlin became separated. In the early years, only by ideological and dogmatic differences, because one side was oriented towards Russia and the other side was oriented towards the West and the United States. But when in 1961, and I think I have another image, when in 1961 the solid concrete Berlin Wall was erected, every collaboration of curators between East and West was made impossible. In the East, the National Gallery had at least a building, the building on the Museum Island, which I showed you earlier. In the West, they had to start with any site or building. They were showing modern and contemporary art in the Charlottenburg Castle and at other places. So after the West Berliners had started to acquire more and more works, there was a need for an own building. Therefore, a small West Berlin delegation visited Mies van der Rohe in Chicago around 1960 and asked him to come back to Germany to create a very last building, a museum for West Berlin, the Mies building. Here you see the splendid opening in 1968 for the Neue Nationalgalerie. The term Neue means new, the new National Gallery. In the first 3 months, almost 500,000 visitors came. It was a sensation back then in the late 1960s. And the opening exhibition in the Great Hall, by the way, was an exhibition of the Dutch modern painter Piet Mondrian. Afterwards, in the 1970s and 1980s, throughout many, many years, two national gallery exists next to each other, just a couple of miles away, without any contact. One in the West, with a strong focus in the collection on realism, political imagery, and traditional sculpture, and one national gallery in the West, with a stronger focus on post-war avant-garde, on abstraction, and later also on pop art, conceptual art, arte povera from Italy, and from other contemporary art movements. So when in 1989, the miracle happened and the wall came down, not only two countries were reunified, also two museums became friends again. In the early 90s, all curators from East and West met, the whole collection was merged and reorganized. A very exciting process for all who had been involved. So the art of the 19th century from both institutions, from East and West, was brought to the old building on the Museum Island. And all modern art, again from both sides, was presented at Neue Nationalgalerie. And for the contemporary art, a new building was opened, the Hamburger Bahnhof. And that is the situation which you still find today. 3 major buildings for the one large collection of the National Gallery, ranging from the art of the 19th century up to the art of our time. A shared collection managed by 3 museums and since recent also by 3 directors. But let's get back to our exhibition here. In regard to the art of the 20th century, the encounter of the 2 collections, the collection East and the collection West is really remarkable and interesting. On the one hand, the differences of both collections couldn't be larger. The differences in thinking, in the political system, in the matter of cultures. On the other hand, however, there are surprising similarities in both national galleries, the East and the West. In the East and in the West, there was a strong interest in political works, in artists who focused on issues of society, on social issues, on urban life, on themes of everyday life. So there is a big red line which runs through our whole collection from the early years until our present time, and that is the strong focus on these political and social issues. And let me show, based on the works of this exhibition, how wonderful these two collections match and complement each other. The Nerlinger here, the work I've shown earlier, he is focusing on the life of the working class within a modern setting. This, of course, was acquired by the East. The Kirchner, painting about the Belle Alliance Square, a square in Berlin, was an acquisition of the West. The painting by Wilhelm Nachnit, on the other hand, was an acquisition of the East because it shows worker and machine, as the title says. So the painter again focused on the working class. The Sonja by Christian Schad, with its focus on a stylish nightlife culture with American cigarettes, champagne, etc., was clearly an acquisition of the West. The portrait of the famous dealer Flechtheim, again, was an acquisition of the West, although the critical perspective of Dix towards trade and art selling could have been also a socialist view favored in the East. This clearly political theme by Karl Hofer, anticipating the horrors of World War II, was an acquisition of the East. Ernst Wilhelm Ney became later a hero of post-war abstraction, so the acquisition of this early work of him was purchased by the West. And finally, in the East, however, there was much more a support for female artists, so this work by Alice Lex Nerlinger was acquired by the East. So in the end, you see how rich, how diverse, how pluralistic our collection became by merging the two collections from East and West. And the strong focus on social themes, on themes of society and politics, is really the red line which runs through our great collection. Also makes our collection so different from collections in other German cities, so different also from collections in Paris, London, or Madrid. No other collection in Europe was so much shaped by the effects of the Cold War, was so much shaped by the political climate, the political system. And Berlin, as a city, was always in the center of everything, was where the consequences of politics were immediately palpable for everybody. Even today, I would say, Berlin is a very political city, a city where you will find public demonstrations every week, where you find all kinds of debates, a city also where traditions of the East and the West, maybe today in a more global way, constantly meet each other and clash. So this is kind of my longer answer on, or longer explanation on this exhibition title, Modern Art and Politics. So for us, it is more than just a title. It is a program. It is part of our identity, being a national gallery shaped by our specific history. We see art, to sum it up again, not so much as an isolated discipline, as a l'art pour l'art. We see art much more as being part of a certain society, of a certain history, and a certain culture. Now, what does that mean for programming an exhibition? What are we showing in Berlin right now? What are our plans for the future? Well, as our highlights of modernism are here at the Kimball, we had to be creative, right? Fortunately, our collection offers a lot. So currently we are showing a larger survey on art after 1945 under the title Extreme Tension, and again, under the subtitle Art Between Politics and Society. This here is an image of the catalogue with a photo, a still, from a performance by the German artist Rebecca Horn, which she did in the 1960s. And here you have a view into the very first exhibition space in the Mies building with a juxtaposition of international abstract art featured in the 1950s by the West, and figurative art featured in the 1950s mostly by the East. And this exhibition gives a wide survey on developments until the late 1990s. For the exhibition hall upstairs, Irina Hibbert-Grun, my dear colleague here, is preparing a huge show on the Brazilian artist Lydia Clark, which will open in late May. It will be the first retrospective of this Brazilian artist ever shown in Germany. So if you plan to come to Berlin, try to come this summer to see that show. George mentioned it. We have a huge constructing site next door in the far end. You see the Mies building, and these are my last pictures now. We have a heavy construction site for an extension building. It will be double the size of the Mies building. It will give us more space for the collection, but also for education, for digital media, for theater, for performance, also for shops, restaurants, and bars. The design, George mentioned it, is by Herzogin de Meuron, the distinguished and famous architects from Switzerland. And the name of the new building will be Berlin Modern. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Joachim. That is just exactly what we needed to know about what's going on in Berlin now. And I urge you, if you have a chance to go to Berlin, it's one of the richest cultural cities in the world that I've ever been to. And the whole experience of the Museum Island, moving from the ancient world, ancient Egypt, to the late 19th century, and then on to the Neue Nationalgalerie and the great collections at the Hamburger Bahnhof. It is sensational. So do by all means plan to go. Our next speaker is Melissa Venator, who is the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation Assistant Curator of Modern Art at the St. Louis Art Museum, which has one of the very finest collections of modern German art in the United States. She is a native of Richardson, Texas, yes, here's for DFW. And a graduate of the University of Texas at Austin. She holds master's degrees, including an MBA from the University of Pennsylvania and Southern Methodist University, and earned her doctoral degree at Rice University. Her dissertation subject was about the emergence of electric light art in 1920s Germany. A difficult subject to form an exhibition around, but I bet she's going to do it one of these days. After a fellowship at the Busch Reisinger Museum at the Harvard University Art Museums, she joined the St. Louis Art Museum's curatorial staff in 2019. There she has organized many exhibitions, including a major survey of the museum's great German collections, and is the author of last year's publication on its holdings of German Expressionist art. Right now, she is at work with the 80-year-old Anselm Kiefer on the first American survey of his career since the one held 20 years ago right here at the Modern Art Museum of Fort Worth. And that will open later this year, and I plan to go up to St. Louis to see it. In 1947, the German painter Max Beckmann, about whom you've heard just a moment ago, sailed from Amsterdam, where he had been in exile for almost a decade, to New York, and went on by train to St. Louis, where he was to spend the next 2 years, teaching at Washington University. Because of this, and because of the many friends and admirers he found there, the largest collection of Beckmann's work anywhere in the world is to be found in St. Louis. That remarkable story will be the subject of Melissa Venator's talk to us today, so please welcome her warmly.
Hey, y'all. It's like the only place I won't get made fun of for saying y'all. No, honestly, I was really fortunate to grow up in Richardson. You know, You know what a wonderful art community the Metroplex is. And I came to the Kimball as a child. I came to the Japanese, gardens nearby as well. And I never in a million years thought I would be up here speaking to such a great audience about this topic that's so dear to my heart. And so when I received the invitation, it was just really special to be able to come back and share this part of my life with such an early kind of formative influence in my life, why I'm here today. So thank you. I hope I live up to my promise here. Oh. Also, I talk too much, so I'm going to look at our time, and I'm going to promise to stop at 11:15, okay? So I'm really glad George opened by giving kind of a survey of the different artists in this exhibition. I work on German art. Jim, you'll hear from, works on German art, right? It's incredible to me as he flipped through those slides how different each artist's life was, both because of World War I and because of World War II. And I wish we had the time to talk about each of those artists in detail, and we don't. And so, because this artist, Max Beckmann, was an artist who made it to the United States in 1947, I really wanted to take this opportunity to just tell you a little bit about him, because honestly, outside of St. Louis, he's not very well known, and only in St. Louis because we have this collection. So I'm really doing this as an introduction so that you can get to know his life, his work, and especially the role that the United States played at the very end of his life. And to connect the dots for what's in the exhibition, there are 3 really amazing paintings by Beckmann in the exhibition just upstairs, and I'm not going to talk about them, but I did want to give you a visual reference to the works. They're all from this exile period, and Beckmann was lived in exile from 1933 until the end of his life in 1950, so it was a significant percentage of his life. These are absolute masterpieces from that period, the portrait of the George family in 1935, this self-portrait at a bar of 1942, which he is very specifically known for his self-portraits. If you look across his paintings as well as his works on paper, Beckmann produced dozens and dozens, almost 100 self-portraits at different times. So it was a major genre, and as many as he made, they're rare as hen's teeth, and so every museum wants one, so you're very fortunate to be able to see one in this show. And finally, the portrait of Erhard Goepel from 1944, a very important and significant year. And as I say, apologies, I'm not going to say more about these paintings, but I just wanted you to know who we're talking about. And yeah, to make the point that's already been made, this is our Beckmann gallery at the St. Louis Art Museum. We're very fortunate to have 40 paintings by him, which we just barely eke out the Munich collection. We have 4 more than they do. So it's a very small margin. We also have 400 works on paper, including 75% of Max Beckmann's total print output. He was a very prolific printmaker, which won't especially be reflected in my presentation. And of course, Munich has the Max Beckmann archive, and you'll see some objects from that. So between Munich and St. Louis, and Frankfurt, and of course, all the major German cities do at this point have good holdings by Max Beckmann. But St. Louis really is an important center for research on him. Okay, so as I say, those of you who are experts, you'll bear with me here. I really wanted to just give you a sense of Beckmann's life and work before exile, which I won't go all the way back to his birth in 1884, except to say that he was a young person who always wanted to be an artist, and who really achieved great success and fame at an early age. So he had his first public exhibition in 1906, which was at no lesser venue than the Berlin Secession, which was a major exhibition society and artist support society in Berlin dedicated to promoting the work of contemporary artists working in what was then modern styles. Figures like Lovis Corinth, right, whom I know you guys know quite well because you have a fantastic Corinth here in the collection at the Kimball that's in the show as well. So Corinth was a major figure with the Berlin Secession. The German Impressionists were also active. These were styles of art that in Imperial Germany were not supported through the official kind of art channels. And so the Berlin Secession was founded to promote the work of these artists, to give them a space to exhibit. And Max Beckmann very early on found his footing there. 2 years before this photograph was taken in 1910, he was elected to the executive committee of the Berlin Secession and was the youngest member of that committee at that point. And so what we see here in 1912 is this incredibly successful young artist. He's in his early 30s. You see him seated in front of his massive kind of contemporary take on the history painting, the sinking of the Titanic. But what you don't see is that he's seated in his studio in his own home, built in Berlin, Hermsdorf, in a house that he and his wife, an opera singer, designed. So he's already commercially very successful, critically acclaimed at just such a young age. And we're very fortunate to have this painting at St. Louis, the sinking of the Titanic that you see in the photograph. And I really want to take a moment with this early period before World War I, because the Beckmann we know, the Beckmann that you see in the exhibition, produces art in a very different style. It's much more abstracted. The figures are much more angular. They look much more modern to our eyes. But this constituted modern art and was a modern style in 1912 when he made this painting. He's borrowing the very large format of the history painting, but taking a contemporary subject, the sinking of the Titanic. And you can see, if you're having a hard time, I know it's a very big image, the ship right on the top of the horizon. So this is a Max Beckmann that we don't really see very often in exhibition. And this is a slightly earlier painting from the same period, but I include it to show two things. First, the influence of Lovis Corinth, who's known for these kind of luscious, voluptuous female nudes at this time, right? He's called the painter of flesh in Germany for his nudes. But already in this painting, we see a hint of what's to come with Beckmann. It's a very disturbing scene. We don't know what's happening with it. It's very hard to construct a narrative that explains what we're looking at. Unlike the sinking of the Titanic, it is not a reference to a contemporary event that we know of. We don't know who these people are. We don't know what war they've been in. We don't know why they're nude. We don't know why they're bound. And, you know, the conventional mainstream art world, art critics at this time criticized Beckmann for paintings like this because they said that his nudes all look like nudes in a studio, like artist models, exactly for the artificiality of his scenes. And this painting is a good example of it. So it just proves the point that even though this period, his very early work, doesn't look like the Beckmann we know, it may not look like the Beckmann we love, but we already see these sort of hints of what's to come. He is part of the generation, as were many of these artists, who lived through both World War I and World War II. And like his contemporaries, his experience in World War I was deeply traumatizing. I'm showing you a print that he made from this period that shows an assault. It's interesting because he never saw active combat. Beckmann was very smart, smarter than some of his colleagues, as it turned out. In multiple instances in his life, you see this quality of him. When World War I was looming, and many of the artists, saw it coming before it happened, young men faced kind of two choices. You could wait to be drafted, in which case you would either be in the very physically demanding task of digging trenches, very kind of physically difficult labor, or you would be among the first, kind of on the front line. You would be the frontline soldiers really leading the charge. If you enlisted, you could choose the path. You could go into different directions. So Beckmann, although he wasn't necessarily a big fan of the war, decided to enlist as a medical orderly, which meant that he was unlikely to see kind of active combat. So he was not in the trenches, he was not in the front line, he was not part of an assault that you see depicted here. But what he maybe didn't anticipate is that his war service meant that he spent day out, day in and day out, was busy caring for mortally wounded, kind of dead and dying soldiers. And that was his daily work. The trauma of that experience took a huge toll on him psychologically, and he ended up having a kind of a medical, I've just forgotten what it's called, but he was kind of declared unfit for duty because of his mental illness. And it completely transformed his life. And you hear this repeated in the biographies over and over again, that there were these young men who were artists before World War I, but their experience in World War I, whether they were in active combat like Dix, or whether they were even a medical orderly like Beckmann, completely transformed how they understood their art, how they understood their work as artists, and what their art looked like. Beckmann's kind of life falls apart during the war. He ends up divorcing his wife, they separate. He doesn't go back to Berlin, instead he goes to Frankfurt, primarily for medical care, but he ends up, over the course of his recovery, not making art for a long time, and when he does, he makes paintings like this. And really the first body of work that he makes is a series of religious subjects like Christ in the center that you see here. And we still see these monumental figures, but we see them rendered in a completely different style. And I have to say, they're puppet-like. They have this awkward, angular, stiff sort of body poses. Certainly, the figures themselves are simplified, are made more angular, but there are also these details like the hand gestures. So take a minute to look at the hands in this painting. They're doing these kind of strange gestures. All of the body parts look somewhat dislocated. And you know where I first see, and this is the benefit of being at the St. Louis Art Museum. We have all these vast prints, including ones from his wartime years. Where I first see bodies like this, he does a series of prints on the subject of military morgues. So morgues where bodies of dead soldiers are laid out, and they have this stiff, dislocated quality that we see in his paintings. And really, that quality survives up until the last paintings he makes in 1950. The body's changed, but there is an awkwardness, a focus on hands and hand gesture. And just to make the point of really how dramatic a change this is, I'm just comparing Sinking of the Titanic with Christ in the Center. Even if you ignore the difference in subject matter, and I should say Christ in the Center is a much smaller painting than Sinking of the Titanic, if you look just at the figures in the lifeboats, it's a fundamentally different approach to the human body. And it ends up being really popular. I don't spend as much time in my presentation on the 1920s and 30s, but Max Beckmann, this sort of new style that he comes up with is critically acclaimed by the kind of sympathetic modernist critics almost immediately. He very quickly becomes one of the leading lights of modern art. He gets a job teaching at the art school associated with the Great Städel Museum, which is still in Frankfurt today, and really just kind of picks up with the success he had before the war, but working in this completely different idiom. We see as well traces of contemporary events in his work from this very successful period. Harbor of Genoa at left is absolutely a painting he made while on vacation to Genoa, and he traveled widely in Europe at this time. But that use of black, which is really one of the characteristics of his work, that heavy, heavy use of black, and the fact that many scholars have pointed out that he's making this scene during the rise of Mussolini's kind of control, kind of seizure of power in Italy. and seeing in the darkness of this nocturnal scene a sense of kind of the sun setting on free Europe and this premonition of what's to come. He also becomes very celebrated in the kind of portrait you see on the right, the portrait of Kurt Glaser, as a sort of Neue Sachlichkeit artist, you know, and he has these variations in his style. Sometimes he's more realistic, sometimes he's more abstract. And he certainly goes through a period in the 20s where he's making these more realistic scenes that are very elegant, very clean, very elevated, that cement his reputation as one of Germany's leading modern artists. Which is when it all falls apart in a very kind of slowly, and then it sort of builds speed. In 1933, of course, Hitler comes to power, and one of the first things that happens is that there's a sort of screening of all federal employees to ensure that they were aligned with the ideology of the party. I'm sorry, I don't really mean it's a very strange moment to be a German art specialist because I don't know how else to say it. I promise you I'm not trying to make a point. But because modern art was it was unsanctioned, it was censored by the regime, any artists who were associated with that style basically got fired from their teaching jobs immediately. So Paul Klee loses his job. It's across the board. It doesn't matter whether they're Jewish or not. And so Max Beckmann almost immediately in 1933 loses his job in Frankfurt. And to his credit, this is the second moment where he's very perceptive. He says, "This is very bad. I need to protect myself, and I need to protect my family, and I need to protect my art." So he returns to Berlin, and he really kind of locates the start of his exile at this move, that he has to go to Berlin, a city he knows well, a city where he has a lot of friends, and a city where, because of its size, maybe he can disappear. Maybe he can kind of fly under the radar, so to speak, from the authorities. He'll be very quiet, but he'll be able to keep doing his work. And this is often how this period starts for these artists. There's almost like a self-censorship. Like, maybe if they just don't notice me, I can get by. And I love this painting as a sort of representative of this moment. It's tiny, like it's really small compared to what you've seen. And he painted large and he painted small, so the smallness isn't necessarily a kind of reflection of this moment. But the subject matter is the film studio, which is a wonderful Berlin subject, because of course Berlin was home to this major UFA film studio called Babelsberg, or Neu Babelsberg, right? So it was absolutely a center for European cinema and filmmaking at this time, really part of Berlin culture. So he's taking the subject of the film studio, but it is so claustrophobic, and you see the black, and this dislocated space, these figures that you don't know whether they're people and you don't know whether they're mannequins. It's just very small and very dark. And there's a sense that his life kind of begins to shrink in some ways at this point. However, 37 marks kind of another break where everything starts to pick up. So from 33 to 37, his strategy works. He's in Berlin. Things are going fine. It's not great, but he's getting by. In 1937, 590 of his works are confiscated from German museums by the federal government, which again owns the collection of the federal museums. So in this moment, and like these are very complicated ideas, but in this moment, the German government owned every work of art in its museums. It was government property, basically. And the decision was they could do with it what they wanted, and what they wanted was to get rid of the modern art, which is what Joachim gestured at. So in 1937, Beckmann hears from museum directors, curators, friends, they're taking away your art. And then what happens is the Nazi propaganda exhibition, Degenerate Art, opens in Munich in 1937. It's partnered with a great German art exhibition, right? So you have the negative examples and you have the positive examples of what German artists should be making. And at the speech, Hitler, at the opening speech, Hitler makes very derogatory remarks about the so-called degenerate artists. And Beckmann reads about them in the newspaper and says, that's it. This is serious. Like, I could be facing real existential threat at this point. My family could. And so in his telling, he like literally reads this talk in the paper, takes his bags, gets he and his wife copy on the train, and they go to Amsterdam where his sister lives. And it's a little bit slower than that, but because he is really at a very early stage saying, I have to get out of Germany now, he's able to take his studio contents with him. He's able to take his archives with him, which is something that many artists are not able to do, right? In this, and I haven't even talked about the painting on this. I'm already running late, see guys, this is the problem. I'll try to pick it up. He makes these series of incredible triptychs. What you see in this period are, he gets bigger in size, ironically, but he's spending so much time in the studio. So his sizes get a lot bigger and he starts doing more and more complex kind of compositions, but also he starts to use a lot more mythological and allegorical subject matter, which is partly what you're seeing here. So he makes these series of triptychs starting in 1937. There are only 9 complete, there are 10 in total. They're very intimately associated with his exile period, and they're almost all interpreted as sort of latent commentary on an impending war or on the state of exile, using metaphors of the circus in the case of this triptych, or the theater as a sort of veil through which to convey what's happening in his real life. And he spends 10 years in Amsterdam. You know, he tries to get out, he tries to come to the United States, but you really can't do that unless you have a job offer, which has not changed that much, actually. And it never really happens. He's kind of a little bit slower. And then, you know, and his life in Amsterdam is okay. He can travel around some until 1940, and then it all kind of stops. There's an occupation, and he really is almost, he's not under house arrest, but he feels very unsafe outside, right? So you have this kind of model of exile where everything gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. The stakes get higher and higher. And I've included this, his Dutch kind of residency card, because he gets through the war. He's not arrested. He doesn't go, you know, he actually does pretty well for this time period. But even after the war, and this is the thing, even after the war, 1945, he's so glad that the war is over, but it's still not a relief, because now he's an enemy alien living in the Netherlands. And he, at any moment, the Dutch might decide to rescind his residency. And then, and then where would he be, right? They freeze his accounts. So even though he's able to sell his art, he can't get proceeds from it. Like, he can't support himself doing it. And in the meantime, he's starting to get offers of work from Germany. And it really causes a kind of a crisis to decide what is he going to do? Because, so fortunately, all of his letters survive and have been published. And it's so moving to read them from this period, because he is older. He already has a very serious heart condition at this point. He desperately wants to go home. But home to him is the Germany he left in 1932, right? He wants to go back to the life he had. And all of those people are gone, and all of those places are gone. And he doesn't come outright, but reading between the lines in the letters, he's very worried about going back to Germany, where there are still a lot of potentially former Nazi sympathizers, some of whom may still be in charge of museum and kind of art world centers. And he just doesn't know. And it kind of breaks his heart a little bit because it's that moment where you can't go home again. So he's old, he doesn't speak English, he's very ill, but all he knows is that he wants to make art again. He wants to be free. He can't go back to Germany. He has to find a new way. And that's where we get to St. Louis. And I had to include this little anecdote. So this is a section where I explain how and why he came to St. Louis. And it starts with a very familiar figure for Fort Worth, which is Philip Guston, but not the Philip Guston we know from the works that are on view at the Modern right now. This Philip Guston, who's much earlier, 1947 to 48, this painting, so he's working in a very different style, very young guy. He's teaching on the faculty at Washington University in St. Louis. And in 1946, he receives an award, a one-year kind of fellowship. So he's going to take a one-year leave from the faculty, and so they have to replace him, but on a one-year contract. And this man, who looks like Howdy Doody, I mean, if I could meet one person on this slide deck, it would probably be Max Beckmann, right? But he's a close second. Perry Rathbone, who was a really pioneering director, and specific for you guys might be interested in knowing, he was a monuments man. So the gap in his directorship at the St. Louis Art Museum, he was doing his own war service. Unusually for an American art director at this time, was a big fan of German modernism. At this moment, French modernism is really the most dominant modern art style what am I trying to say? It's the most privileged sort of version of modernism in the United States, right? You want Picasso, you want Matisse. Many Americans, including curators, didn't know anything about what was happening in Germany. And on top of that, we had just fought a war against Germany. No one was very happy with the Germans at this particular point. Perry Rathbone had a more sophisticated outlook on it. When he found when he learned that this position was coming open at WashU, he worked with the head of the department there, as well as Beckmann's dealer in New York, Kurt Valentine, to get that job offered to Beckmann. And a lot of Americans were doing this because the situation in Europe was so catastrophic. There were a lot of artists who were trying to get out, and there was a network of Americans like Rathbone who were trying to find opportunities to get them out. Okay, I'm at 11:02. So I wanted to give you a sense of his arrival in St. Louis and kind of how we as Americans kind of were introduced to him. This is how St. Louisans learned about Max Beckmann, and I want to read some from it because it includes some interview material that's very touching. So it opens, it says, Max Beckmann, leader of the German expressionist art. That's not correct. He was not an expressionist, and I won't talk about that, but he wasn't an expressionist. He was a German modernist, but it's okay, they tried. Who escaped to Holland for 10 years of secret painting activity in exile, met 20 advanced painting students, assigned him this morning at the Washington University School of Fine Arts, and began a, quote, new and promising artistic life in this country. It's thrilling to be able to teach the young again. Remember, he lost his job as a teacher in 1933. So is this 1947? He's finally allowed back in a classroom again, right? I shall devote myself to developing their individual personalities. I promise not to raise a flock of little Beckmanns, which is a really charming concept. And he goes on to talk about really making paintings as an escape from this very limited life he had in Amsterdam, where there was no food to eat. There was no coal for heating, the studio in winter, but he worked. And this is one of the interesting features of Beckmann compared to some other artists. His exile years were incredibly prolific. It was as if he took the difficulties that he encountered outside of the studio and brought them into the studio and worked through them there. Not that every painting he made was a function of trauma, it absolutely wasn't. Not that he was locked in his studio for this entire time, he wasn't. But he channeled all of that energy into his art in a way that was really remarkable. So, this is a lighter section. I kind of wanted to share with you some documents that from his time in St. Louis, from his arrival. This is an absolutely charming drawing, not by Beckmann, but by his wife, Matilda, who went by the nickname Kwapi, and I'll read it to you. It's a cartoon documenting their arrival in St. Louis. So we came to New York on a very hot day, and there are a lot of complaints about the heat in New York, which thank God they didn't come to Fort Worth. That's all I have to say. Then went to St. Louis without much delay. The people seemed happy, and indeed St. Louisans are very nice. And it was nice to see, and that, oh geez, this is actually my art museum. So it was nice to see the park and Washington University. Kwapi had excellent English, so she was even able to rhyme. He was back in the classroom. This was so important and meaningful to him. These are actually images from his time in Brooklyn. So he was at WashU for 2 academic years, from 47 to 48, and then 48 to 49. And that Philip Guston, who I have issues with, refused to officially formally resign. So they had to keep offering Beckmann year-long contracts, which is why ultimately, as an immigrant, he had to have permanent employment in order to get permanent residency. And so he ended up having to take a job in Brooklyn. But so these are images from his time in Brooklyn. Perry Rathbone curated the first American retrospective of Max Beckmann's art at the St. Louis Art Museum in 1948. And it's really a testament to the openness of this country that it traveled to so many venues so soon after the war. He also was part of this sort of artistic life of St. Louis. I love this pairing of pictures. Look at Beckmann's expression. He was such a grump. I mean, really, he was such a grump. And I don't think that clown painting made it through. This was probably a hanging committee, and I think Beckmann said no to the clown painting. He was part of this large community. I mean, he found himself in a large community of faculty members like Fred Conway, whose portrait is at St. Louis, students like Wally Barker, who's at the paintings at Milwaukee, Perry Rathbone, who went on to be a great director at the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, and collectors and young collectors who were really interested in modern and contemporary art. I'm looking at all you young collectors out there who can play really important roles in fostering artist careers, so Louise Pulitzer of the Pulitzer family. He also was just really active in the life of the university. This is such an iconic type of subject matter for Beckmann. He loved going to balls and masked balls. It was one of his favorite things to do. And this painting he actually made representing a student, an art student fundraising masked ball that he attended in St. Louis. So it just looks like a Beckmann painting, but actually, it began in this kind of experience, this very specific event that actually he refused to leave the party, and Kwapi had to go home on her own, and then complained in a letter that she didn't know how Max got back home afterwards. So he was really a party guy for all he was also a grump. He was a tourist. Missouri has a lot of caves, and one of them is Merrimack Caverns. If you come to St. Louis, I recommend you go. He went, showing this kind of history of tourism. So that's Max and Kwapi, his wife, and he's pointing to the mouth of the cavern next to the souvenir shop, next to the gift shop, right? So I imagine he's making a joke based on what Kwapi is laughing at him. This is just a beautiful painting. I'm really talking about his life here, but to say that he continued to make really exceptional paintings. This is a fairly small one. It shows the scene outside of a train over the frozen Mississippi River, probably on his way to Chicago or something. But he traveled as well because it was his first time in the United States. He went to California. He went to Colorado, saw the Garden of the Gods. Here's the picture of it. This is an absolutely gorgeous landscape. that I hope you can see in person one day, but it really just, I've included it to make the point that he is still, after all that he's been through, this incredibly accomplished artist making some of his best works at this moment in his life. But again, his residency was uncertain, and so, he really had to make a move. He ended up taking the job in Brooklyn and was considering whether to apply for papers when unfortunately his heart condition caught up with him, and he kind of tragically died of a heart attack while he was going on a walk in Central Park, which maybe is not the worst way to pass. So I've given myself absolutely no time to talk about why St. Louis has this incredible collection. In part, yes, so Beckmann was in St. Louis, and that was a contributing factor. But as is so often the case with these great collections, it came down to a single visionary collector, in our case, Morton D. May, who was a third-generation department store executive. He owned May department stores, and that's an important kind of detail coming into his collecting. He was a young man during World War II, served in the Navy. Right before the war, he built this modernist home for himself in St. Louis. And kind of after the war, he started thinking about needing to fill it with art, as one did if one commissioned a house from Samuel Marks in the 1940s. And the recommendation was made to him that he should really look at Max Beckmann. And then around the time he was having these questions and looking for artists, he was able to attend the 1948 retrospective of Beckmann's art, really fell in love with it, and started at that point first to get to know the artist. So May actually commissioned a portrait from Beckmann just in order to meet him, which he did. And although, as I say, Beckmann passed fairly quickly, May cultivated a relationship with his wife, with his widow, and so many of May's Beckmann collection works were purchased from the family directly. But also I wanted to share this with you, which I probably should have cut for time reasons, but if any of you are art collectors, you might find this really interesting. May was a department store executive, and he knew when he saw a good buy, right? So at this time in the United States, German modernism was incredibly cheap. Now, this is an invoice from 1951, and like inflation, like it's hard to compare 51 and current numbers. But what you're seeing is that he bought 7 paintings and 1 framed watercolor, 17 watercolors and drawings for a grand sum of $4,000. And to give you a sense of what that is, he was buying Picassos. You couldn't get a Picasso for $4,000, like not even one. That gives you a sense. And so he admired the art, and these are not Beckmann's, but they're by Beckmann's contemporaries. So really the impetus was that he thought this art, including Beckmann, deserved more attention than it was getting. And he was going to buy up all of it that he could find, all of it that he could afford, and he was going to make people pay attention to it. And by 55, 57, the rest of the United States started to catch up. And interestingly, after that happened and the prices for this art got high, he basically stopped collecting that art and started collecting what was another love of his, African, Oceanic, and ancient American art. And when he died in 1983, he gave his entire collection to the St. Louis Art Museum, over 5,000 individual works of art, which makes him still to this day our single largest donor of art. So if you're a collector, be like Morton D. May. And here's a picture of his studio. So I didn't do too bad. I have like 2 minutes, and I think that's what. So as you can tell, I've really fallen in love with Beckmann from my time in St. Louis, and one of the really incredible documents that I found was Perry Rathbone's eulogy at the time of Beckmann's death, because his death was very sudden for the people who had gotten to know him in St. Louis. And it's a very touching document, so I just wanted to read a few paragraphs of that to close out my talk, and also to give you a sense of the impact that he made on Americans who got to know him. So, dear friends of Max Beckmann, and I think we all are at this point, how can I do justice to the memory of our departed friend? Honor him we do by our presence here. And you know in your hearts, as I do, that our silent presence speaks more deeply of our feelings for him than any poor words that I can summon. Yet we must find words, as much to comfort and solace our hearts as to honor our late beloved friend. We must do it with tenderness and sincerity, with warmth but not sentimentality, for that is how Max would have had it. That, in short, was his nature, the nature he reserved for his friends. Tender and sincere, unsentimental but compassionate and warm of heart. And now I'll skip. I had a lot of other passages selected, but now I'm going to have to cut them, but that's okay. So I'll just skip to the ending. Max Beckmann accepted the world as something limited, something wonderful and strange but finite. He always understood that space and time were mysteries far beyond it, and that individual souls were the uttermost mystery of our existence. He had the gift of the poet to dream, and he felt himself in almost mystical communion with his departed heroes, whose continuing life he never questioned. His visions were more real to him than reality, and he professed that he could only grasp, could only lay hold upon these intimations by the power and beauty of painting. My dear friends, that he did and that we know. But with his modesty, he belittled himself as a master of words. And I turn finally to one of his most beautiful and touching statements. So this is a quote from Beckmann himself. And then I awoke and yet continued to dream. Painting constantly appeared to me as the one and only possible achievement. I thought of my grand old friend Henri Rousseau, that Homer in the Porter's Lodge, whose prehistoric dreams have sometimes brought me near the gods. I saluted him in my dream. Near him, I saw William Blake, noble emanation of English genius. He waved friendly greetings to me like a super-terrestrial patriarch. Quote, "Have confidence in objects," he said. "Do not let yourself be intimidated by the horror of the world. Everything is ordered and correct and must fulfill its destiny in order to attain perfection. Seek this path, and you will attain from your own ego ever deeper perception of the eternal beauty of creation. You will attain increasing release from all that which now seems to you sad or terrible." I awoke and found myself in the midst of a boundless world turmoil. But my belief in the final release and absolution of all things, whether they please or torment, was newly strengthened. Peacefully, I laid my head among the pillows to sleep and dream again. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa, for such a beautiful lecture. How many people in this audience would like to see a retrospective of Max Beckmann at the Kimball Art Museum? Can I? Yeah. I think so. Absolutely. This brings us to our our last talk of the morning, our third talk of the morning, by James Van Dyke, who is the Associate Professor and Director of Graduate Studies at the University of Missouri in Columbia. He holds a bachelor's degree from the College of Worcester in Ohio, and both master's and doctoral degrees from Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois, outside Chicago. He has spent many years living in Germany across the span of his career, while also teaching at Reed College in Oregon and at Oberlin College in Ohio before joining the faculty at the University of Missouri in 2010. He has studied and written about many of the artists whose works are on view in modern art and politics in Germany. His PhD dissertation, for instance, was a study of Franz Radziwiłł, author of the mesmerizing depiction of two ocean liners in the port of Bremerhaven and a magic realist fantasia on the subject of air warfare in Flanders in the last gallery of the exhibition. His research has been supported by many prestigious grants from the German-American Academic Exchange Service, the Greta Henkel Stiftung, the Getty Research Library, the National Humanities Center, and the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts at the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. He has a project in the works that studies the corporate identity of Royal Dutch Shell against the political backdrop of Europe and America between the two world wars. A fascinating idea. His book on Otto Dix, some 15 years in the works, will be published by the University of Chicago Press in a year's time. Today, he is going to speak to us about Otto Dix, his friend Alfred Flechtheim, and the problem of the artist's portrait of that astonishing art dealer and cultural impresario. Will you welcome James Van Dyke?
Good morning. How's everybody doing? You're strong. Do you need a minute to catch your breath? Do you need a minute to massage your necks, you poor people? It's like, wow. Right? So take a minute. I'm going to get a bottle of water and get myself situated, and I'll be quiet so that you can. It's been a long stretch, right? Great lectures, lovely lectures. I should have told George that I can do Texas too. I was born in Big Spring, where I don't remember it. I was a baby when we moved, because those were the days when your mother was an Air Force nurse working at Webb Air Force Base and had a child. She was immediately discharged, and we moved to California. But there are photos of me between cotton fields, and there are stories of scorpions and that sort of thing. So I don't remember Big Spring, but I'm absolutely thrilled to experience Fort Worth and the Kendall Museum today, yesterday, and the day before. It's been a joy to experience the museum, the architecture, the collection, to get to meet the people who work here, and to see the show from Berlin. I wrote to my friends, it's almost like being in Berlin if you look really hard at the architecture and the show. I want to thank the curators in Berlin for doing such a lovely job with the exhibition. It's a great show. It's a well-done show. It has excellent labels, frank labels, labels that suggest what art history can be, what art history can be when it addresses politics honestly and frankly, and is not afraid to show very difficult works. And that's what I'm talking about today, is a very difficult, problematic picture. I want to thank George, the Deputy Director of the Kimball, and Nancy Edwards, the Curator of European Art, for the invitation to participate in the program accompanying this truly remarkable exhibition where I'm seeing a lot of friends in terms of pictures. And I also want to acknowledge the efforts of the entire staff, but especially Rebecca Goss, the curatorial assistant, who made all the arrangements absolutely perfectly. So Rebecca, wherever you are, thank you. With that said, I'm going to take a slightly different approach here. Instead of a broad survey of Dix, that sounds terrible. Instead of a broad survey of Otto Dix's work and career, instead of the broad survey of the history of German art and politics, which you've already heard, I'm going to do a kind of a deep dive, which is what my work is all about, details, moving from the detail to the totality, and you're going to get a taste of that. So how many of you know The Matrix, the movie? All right, so remember when Morpheus puts the probe back into Neo's neck to put him in the simulation? He says, what does he say? This is going to feel a little weird. So it's going to be a little bit different, okay? So I hope it's interesting and enjoyable nonetheless, even though this is the last of all these lectures. My lecture today revolves around one painting by Otto Dix, namely his portrait of the art dealer Alfred Flechtheim, which you see on the screen. This important, iconic, excessive, outrageous picture was completed in 1926. It made its critically acclaimed public debut in Berlin in an exhibition of the new objectivity organized by Dix's dealer, Karl Nierendorf, in 1927. Of course, it is currently here at the Kimball Art Museum as part of the Nationalgalerie's excellent exhibition Modern Art and Politics in Germany, which affords me the opportunity to return to some thoughts I've had for some time about this painting, which tells us much about Dix, Weimar culture, and German society between the world wars. And you're going to hear a lot of things come up in this talk, no matter how different it is that you've already heard in the previous lectures, leitmotifs, if you will. In the course of my discussion, I will suggest possible ways to conceive of Dix's intentions as he worked to position himself within the field of contemporary German art production, and as he fulminated against the art market on which he was dependent most of the time. I will draw attention in particular to one incompletely understood motif within this painting, and then situate it within a broader discursive field. I will consider the ideological implications of one word in one letter found in Dix's papers. These are small things, mere details, but this talk is meant to suggest broader concerns. This material and my approach to it are related to my forthcoming book, In the Tradition of the Social History of Art. That is a history of art that seeks to explore the functions of art not only as a form of pleasurable, usually, aesthetic experience, as important as that is, as necessary as that is, but also as the mediated expression of social and political ideologies. My aim is not to retell the familiar story of the daring, admirable, avant-garde hero. Even as I seek to underscore the fascinating power of Dix's work, I mean to show how a determining array of dialogues, relationships, and channels made his extraordinarily interesting yet problematic painting possible. I seek to track and clarify the painter's changing position in a complex field of cultural production, writing about his actions in conditions not of his own making, in dialogue and competition with others, in alignment or conflict with social values and ideas. I wish implicitly to keep in mind the German Jewish philosopher Walter Benjamin's famous dictum, written shortly before Benjamin committed suicide rather than be deported to a concentration camp: there is no document of culture which is not at the same time a document of barbarism. This seems to be all too timely and relevant to Dix's work. You can see why I'm attracted to German painting. It's so heavy, it's so dark, but it's so fascinating. That's why you're all here, right? It's like it's proof of the concept that German art is just the best art. It's so interesting, engaging, and outrageous sometimes. Having outlined my general ambitions, let me sketch what made Dix one of the most famous and infamous artists of his time. Born in 1891 to skilled working-class parents in a small industrial city, and there's his mother, there's his father, there's Dix, and there are his three siblings. Dix began training as an applied artist in 1910, before spending the years 1914 to 1918 in the trenches as a machine gunner. So he did see combat, and a lot of it. In the months and years following Germany's defeat, Dix participated in the activities of expressionist and Dadaist avant-garde circles and sought markets in Dresden, Berlin, and Düsseldorf. He associated with left-wing artists without ever committing himself to a political party. There he is here with this group of friends and associates in Dresden, and here is his picture at the first International Dada Fair. There's Hannah Hirsch, there's Raoul Hausmann, and so on. His technically and stylistically protean and thematically provocative work often dwelt on sex, violence, and war, Leder, veteran soldiers who've lost their limbs, sex workers on the right. Perceived by some as brilliantly subversive and by others as abjectly obscene or unpatriotic, it provoked heated debate and occasional repressive measures by the police. Yet for all the vituperation aroused by his pictures, the upward trajectory of Dix's career before 1933 was unusually steep. His high visibility as a fool, speaking truth to power, as a bad boy, and as a technical virtuoso, from the tabloids, as you see here on the left, the Berlin Illustrierte Zeitung, one of the biggest tabloids of the day, to elite art journals like Das Kunstblatt right here, contributed to official recognition and professional establishment in 1926, when after a year spent at the center of the German art world in Berlin, he was appointed to a professorship at the State Art Academy in Dresden. In the space of only 6 years, he leapt from one end of contemporary artistic production, the avant-garde, to the other, the academy. Extraordinary career. He no longer represented himself as an iconoclastic murderous dandy, as you see on the left in a Dadaist painting of 1920, but rather assumed the guise of a dapper American gentleman, as you see on the right, whose persona and old masterly techniques recalled courtly painters such as Dürer and Velázquez. Instead of suggesting his destructive energy, he now emphasized the fecundity of his imagination, posing here on the right in a photograph published in the press in 1927 as a masculine master of the craft of drawing. Between 1927 and 1933, before the Nazis dismissed him from his professorship, like Beckmann, Dix produced his most ambitious work, revisiting his controversial themes of the early 1920s and perfecting the ironic combination of avant-garde provocation and old masterly technical perfection. These monumental, and in this case, literally hallucinatory, and I wrote about this painting a lot in 2010, I won't go into the weeds, but it's hallucinatory, I want to argue. The left and the right panels are a thematization of the visionary state of one of the men on the left panel. These monumental, and in this case, literary hallucinatory works have become emblems of the Weimar Republic, an historical moment, as we've heard, structured by the trauma of war and economic crisis, democratic uncertainty, electoral fragmentation, and hopes of national renewal. But also a time of exciting new forms of leisure like jazz and wild cultural experiment for at least a few. Equally iconic and often more suited for exhibition marketing these days, however, are the portraits of notable or noticeable figures in Berlin's cultural scene that Dix completed between 1924 and 1926 during the important years he spent there to develop his career. The subjects of these remarkable paintings ranged from the popular neoconservative philosopher and university professor Max Scheler, who you see on the left, to the celebrity doctor Wilhelm Meyer-Hermann. He was a laryngologist, doctor to the stars. Peter Lorre, I think, was one of his patients. And the bohemian writer and new woman Sylvia von Harden, very famous picture on the right. These pictures amused those who saw them on the walls of art galleries or in the pages of illustrated magazines where they were regularly reproduced. They exemplify the painter's eye-catching, intriguing combination of astonishing technical refinement, powerful realism, and snide caricature. He's really snarky, to use our language, right? A snide caricature rooted in Dix's Nietzschean interest in the ugly, in the Nietzschean imperative to laugh, to exaggerate, and to be extreme in order to see truthfully. Vividly suggesting a contradictory world of fashionable excess and leaden austerity, of physiognomic externality and psychological intensity, these portraits, like all of Dix's work, raise issues that were and still are, of broad interest. I bet you're interested. I hope you're interested. And central to current art history, the representation of gender, sexuality, class, and race, the performance of identity, and the aggressive practices of the avant-garde. Today, I want to focus on one of these portraits of one of the luminaries of Weimar culture, namely Alfred Flechtheim, who had been a high-profile figure in Germany's modern art world since establishing himself in 1913 as one of the country's most important dealers of contemporary art, mostly French, but also German. The picture is characteristic of Dix's portrait of the mid-1920s, as we just saw it. It exemplifies his programmatic effort to move from Dadaist iconoclasm to a relatively expressive, quite textured adaptation of the techniques, formats, and iconographies associated with the canonical artists of the Northern Renaissance, and to adapt them to the depiction of modern life. I encourage you to look carefully at this picture, its technique, its surfaces, and then go to the Kahn building and look at the 15th century portraits there and see how similar, but also how different they are. For me, the painter declared in 1927 in his sole published artist statement, the new in painting is in the expansion of its material, in an intensification of expressive forms already more or less present in the old masters. In paintings such as this portrait, Dix thus showcased his brilliant ability to generate complex and nuanced coloristic and textural effects, layers of pigment over layers of pigment glazes that are all intermingling. It's incredibly exquisite. To mimic the appearances of wood grain and gilt frames, flesh tones and textiles, and even the Parisian modernism with which Flechtheim was identified. Furthermore, the portrait suggests the always teasing and, of course, here sometimes cutting quality that was typical of his depictions of acquaintances, friends, patrons, peers, and rivals. He was ruthless almost all the time. Indeed, most commentators have concluded that this painting is not a charming or amusing caricature. In fact, the people in the gallery I was listening to yesterday were concluding the same thing, but rather something far more difficult, far more negative. It has been seen as the portrait of, quote, a shrewd art dealer, of a, quote, greedily haggling businessman, or someone, quote, cunningly trying to soften up a prospective client with erotic drawings before trying to sell a difficult painting. Flechtheim's arms and hands have been seen to make an almost predatory gesture, betraying something hidden by his mask-like face. Such characterizations are certainly not entirely off the mark. By all accounts, Flechtheim very much disliked the picture. It seems unlikely that he would have called it a tribute of any kind, as it is characterized upstairs, not even a complicated one. Yet until recently, scholars were reluctant to assess the portrait not merely as the unflattering representation of an important art dealer, but rather specifically and more importantly of a prominent, much maligned Jewish art dealer. Even one of the first who did, namely the German art historian Andreas Strobel, sought to diffuse the issue by appealing to Flechtheim's actual features, underplaying the distortions and exaggerations of Dix's portrayal. I'm just looking to see if I missed the slide now. Okay. His huge nose, which corresponds to all the cliches of Jewish physiognomy, and I'm quoting here, and his small stature determined his appearance. It is hence scarcely an exaggeration to characterize Flechtheim as a caricature of himself. Even if it is difficult to discuss this theme today, so marked by the inflammatory images of the National Socialist press. I see, I was so wound up in my script. So here we have this sense of of Dick's, the way in which art historians seek to diffuse this picture by looking at photographs which were very widespread in Weimar Germany and saying, well, yeah, you know, there's a resemblance. A very different argument is made in the catalog of the great exhibition of Weimar portraiture, Glitter and Doom, that was shown at the Met in 2006 in New York. Rather than emphasize the resemblance between sitter and portrait, the author there suggests that the painting is nothing but a reinscription of the stereotype of the, quote, rapacious Jew, unquote. Quote, the worldly and sophisticated Flechtheim, a force in the international art market and a propagandist for the most cerebral new art movements, Cubism, this writer continues, quote, is reduced to a Shylock. This damning characterization squarely raises the problem with this picture. But I nonetheless think there's more to be said. Even if the issue has made it by now to the extremely compressed genre of the wall label. You'll read something of this upstairs. So I would like to take another look to understand more precisely what Dix might have been trying to do in this painting as he was framed by and maneuvered within determining social forces, ideological discourses, and cultural institutions. We know that the portrait was not the product of commission. It was not ordered by Flechtheim. Unlike many of Dix's portraits, it was not made to pay the bills. On the other hand, it is unlikely that Dix's decision to paint the picture was the result of a whim, though a certain degree of initial spontaneity is suggested by an early compositional sketch jotted in the margin of a letter of July 1926 from a conservator who wished to resolve some unpleasant affair with the painter. We don't know what that is. I don't know if it had to do with Flechtheim or not. Flechtheim was no Sylvia von Harden, the little-known journalist whose appearance reportedly struck Dix so much one evening in Berlin's Romanisches Café, a famous haunt of the city's artists, writers, and intellectuals, that he immediately asked her, I have to paint you. Flechtheim was not exactly a figure of authority who could make or break a career, but he mattered. The portrait thus has to be regarded as one of several uncommissioned portraits with which Dix aimed to make a public statement. I'm trying to get my distance from the mic. I'm afraid it was too far away and I'm too close. So, given Flechtheim's stature in the German art world and the number of portraits of him made by well-known contemporary artists at the time, one surmises that Dix decided to include Flechtheim among his own pantheon of portraits of distinct Berliners, art stars, literary lions, distinctive bohemians, in order programmatically to stake out a position for himself in the city's contemporary artistic culture. He no doubt wanted to measure up with and outdo his peers. Furthermore, it is conceivable that Dix meant more generally, categorically, to invoke, challenge, and one-up the established Viennese expressionist Oskar Kokoschka, who made a name for himself in Berlin between 1910 and 1916 with nervous, painterly portraits of contemporary artists and intellectuals, including the dealer, publisher, and impresario Herwart Walden, one of Flechtheim's big predecessors. And you can see several pictures by Kokoschka upstairs to get a sense of how they're painted. That Dix could have wished to engage with Kokoschka's Berlin portraits is suggested by the manifold connections between the two painters' work and careers. For instance, Kokoschka had been one of the first artists, as you see on the left, to depict the theme of sex murder, which was of considerable interest to Dix and other Dadaists between 1917 and 1922, as you see on the right again, and both he and Dix had depicted themselves as the perpetrators of such grisly crimes. What is more, Kokoschka had been made professor in Dresden just as Dix returned there after the war in late 1918, and in 1920, Dix, like other radical artists, had responded scathingly in two major pictures to Kokoschka's infamous appeal to revolutionary and counter-revolutionary fighters to move their battles away from the art museum to the edge of town in order not to hurt the pictures. The left-wing artists that Dix hung out with were like, I'd rather the pictures get destroyed than a worker's body. So they were not happy with Kokoschka. And finally, in 1926, Dix was offered an appointment to the Dresden Academy as Kokoschka's successor. So the portrait of Flechtheim, I think, has something to do with him thinking about his relationship to other artists and their work. There is also reason to believe that Dix may have made the portrait of Flechtheim in direct response to critical challenges issuing from the dealer and his circle at just that time. 1926 was not only a year of great success for Dix in the form of his first major mid-career retrospective in Berlin and the offer of the professorship in Dresden, so it was a good year for Dix, 1926, like, all right. But it also marked the publication of the art critic Carl Einstein's, no relation to Albert, but Einstein, Carl Einstein's widely read Art of the 20th Century, a kind of survey of contemporary art. There, Einstein went on brilliantly for pages. He was one of the great writers of 20th century art criticism. Went on brilliantly for pages about Cubism as the most radical, significant, and meaningful art of the century, while Dix was dismissed in an insultingly brief paragraph as a painting reactionary on leftist motifs. Though for a time Einstein had participated in Berlin Dada and had once admired Dix's work, this widely read survey emphatically reiterated the critic's old belief, shared with his occasional collaborator Flechtheim, in the primacy of Cubism as a radical form of vision. And in fact, the book was illustrated with many works from Flechtheim's collection, so his name came up a lot. Now, as I've argued elsewhere, Dix was an ambitious, thin-skinned, combative artist who felt obliged to respond to this characterization, reactionary painter. He clearly did so in another painting of civil war, which he signed on the hand grenade of a counter-revolutionary soldier. And he may have also responded in this picture of Flechtheim, Einstein's friend and associate. Dix pastiched Cubist paintings in the background of the portrait and affixed his signature to one of them. The pyramidal composition of the portrait and its somber palette recalls to a degree Picasso's portraits of the dealers Ambroise Voland and Daniel Henry Kahnweiler, who was an old friend and a partner of Flechtheim. But Dix did so to make a critical point about his difference, to assert the range of his skills and the superiority of his painting. Take that, Einstein. Seeking to define himself and to build his career in Weimar Germany's extremely competitive art world, and on a chronically tight art market, Dix advanced here a conception of contemporary art as wry, historicist pastiche that differed significantly from forms of modernism that traced their lineage back to Edward Manet and Impressionism. Dix advanced an alternative model of modern art that did not revolve around process, materiality, and indexical marks as elements of a critique of academicism, but rather about reference and irony and play. Finally, Dix may also have taken the opportunity not only to rise to the professional challenge posed in general by the Francophilic taste community in Berlin's artistic culture, embodied by Flechtheim, but also to exact a little revenge ad hominem. Flechtheim may have grown to see something in Dix eventually, but there is no trace of Dix in the pages of Flechtheim's elegant magazine, Der Querschnitt, one of the few magazines of the time that didn't publish work by Dix. And in early 1924, Dix's dealer, Karl Nierendorf, had sent 2 letters to the painter in which he told Dix about irritating or offensive things Flechtheim had done or said about the painter's work. In the first, Nierendorf, perhaps anxious about his ability to retain the biggest, strongest artist in his own stable, contrasted Flechtheim's alleged commercial cynicism with Nierendorf's own honest love of art and devotion to Dix in particular. So, hey, Otto, I'm a good guy. Flechtheim, he's not a good guy. And in the second letter, Nierendorf wrote, Flechtheim curses once again, calls you the way I've read this document, Forzenmaler, and it's untranslatable, and tells everyone your pictures stink. He again sings the praises of his Frenchmen and always gives you as the German counterexample of awful painting, of stinky painting, just terrible stuff. In many of his pictures of the 20s and 30s, Dix both profiled himself as the modernizer of an old national artistic tradition and at the same time responded sharply to such criticisms of his work. And that's what I think is going on here in part. It helps explain its cause very granularly in the social relationships of German art in the 1920s. Certainly annoyed, challenged, and perhaps threatened by Flechtheim and the prestigious French modernist art he marketed, Dix painted a portrait of his prominent antagonist that art critics across the spectrum acclaimed when it was exhibited for the first time in 1927. Very successful picture. The liberal Max Osborne saw it as an unheard of achievement. The right-wing Bruno Werner concurred, calling the portrait an extraordinarily good picture that gave, quote, shape and face of the age. How wonderful, we might think. Consensus. Light had been seen by everybody. Dix had arrived. Yet for a right-wing critic like Werner to call a portrait of Flechtheim the face of an age was possibly to do more than promote Dix as the strongest art of his generation. It was, of course, also to hint that this picture, in the critic's view, visualized the, quote, and I'm quoting here, Jewish spirit that many Germans, as scholars, historians have written about, at that time believed had infiltrated and weakened the German nation. Indeed, in 1931, there in the middle, a photograph of Alfred Flechtheim with Cubist paintings appeared in the right-wing book, The Face of Democracy, that attacked the Weimar Republic and its culture. Echoing Nierendorf's earlier letter to Dix, in this book, Flechtheim was not described as an idealistic, passionate art lover. He was instead vilified as a materialist, manipulative manager of modern art who makes art and artists. This idea of a cynical manipulator making art careers, a kind of fraud, if you will, was an idea that the Nazis would propagate and throughout their regime. Such an interpretation of Dix's painting would have been enabled by certain things that the painting indicated about Flechtheim's body and behavior. It is certainly not wrong to note the likeness that Dix achieved in this portrait. Indeed, in comparison to a color study for the painting, in which Flechtheim's nose appears as a colossal protuberance emerging from a small phallic head above a garment that could be a kaftan. Yeah, it's kind of awfully hardly, I suppose. Well, it's doing some, yeah, all right. The painting seems virtually photographic. The point is that from this to the painting, something happens, right? The painting does, in fact, bear a strong resemblance to its model. Its trompe-l'oeil representation of materials is remarkable, and the portrait, to be quite sure, is quite far from those egregious anti-Semitic caricatures that circulated in early 20th century German visual culture. Dix transformed Flechtheim neither into a, maybe I should go here, neither into a kosher brute, as cartoonists once had done to the painter Max Liebermann, nor into a lecherous seducer of blonde-haired and blue-eyed girls imagined by the agitators who illustrated the Nazi Der Stürmer. He did not even tattoo the dealer with the Star of David, as he himself had done in 1925 in a private caricature of one of his friends and best patrons, the lawyer and art collector Fritz Glaser. The imperative to observe precisely and to characterize accurately pushed Dix to move, I would suggest, to a degree, from the cartoonish type of stereotyping fantasy, the abstraction of stereotype, if you will, to the concrete presence, an empirically grounded individuation crucial to the traditional portrait. Yet a few of Dix's letters and drawings prove that he very well knew the conventions widely used to caricature Jews. And for all of its resemblance, the portrayal of Flechtheim with dark, almond-shaped eyes, enormous hooked nose, yellowish gray skin, hunchback, and a crotch that is nothing more than a void, which I think might refer, and I'll show you another slide in a moment, to the Central European conception of circumcision, is not an exercise in simple, transparent verisimilitude. The bundling of these tropes brings to mind Sander Gilman's discussion of all of these traditional stereotypical markers of Jewish racial difference and sexual pathology in Central European culture. The portrait's extraordinary verisimilitude may individualize and ground the portrait, but at the same time, it functions here not only to showcase Dix's skill, to foreground Flechtheim's individuality, but also to naturalize these exaggerations and conventions. The painting is neither simply a good likeness nor wholly a caricature, but rather an amalgamation of the two. This was always key to Dix's best paintings and the source of their critical tension. But here and now, in this painting, it is of course profoundly troubling. How are we doing? Okay, all right. Just as important as all of this, however, is the painting's lower left corner, where the fingertips of the dealer's bejeweled hand touch two sheets of paper, which are the support for a drawing of female nudes on top, for sure, reminiscent of Picasso's post-war classicism. In fact, Dix forges Picasso's signature right down here, so it's Picasso. And indeed, typically scholars have understood this detail in narrative terms. One has suggested, for instance, that Flechtheim is showing the drawing to a client who stands outside the frame. Maybe it's you looking at the picture, who shows the drawings to a client in order to use the drawings as a lost leader, if you will, for a more difficult painting. This may be so, but there is another way to look at this depiction of the sensuously lipped, heavily lidded, densely material dealer reaching over and across the sheets to touch the pale, delicate image of ethereal female bodies that epitomized traditional Western ideals of feminine beauty in the classical tradition. As the socialist cultural historian Edward Fuchs had discussed at length in his book, The Jews in Caricature, which was published in 1921 in response to the wave of anti-Semitic agitation that swept across Germany after its military defeat, the theme of excessive Jewish sensuality and sexuality had been a staple of anti-Semitic humor and caricature in Europe for centuries. Furthermore, a popular study of sex crime, which Dix is known to have owned and used to produce other paintings, claimed that Jewish men were disproportionately involved in the illicit sex industry as pimps and pornographers. So this is the discourse that I'm talking about in which Dix and other German artists were operating, right? If Flechtheim were shown gazing at the drawings he touches, then one might imagine that Dix had meant to suggest the intimate, physical nature of the love of art, much like Renoir had done in a portrait of the important French dealer Ambroise Vollard in 1908. And Flechtheim was a passionate collector whose love of art was always in tension with his business. However, given that Flechtheim does not look down, one suspects that some viewers viewers like that right-wing critic Bruno Werner could and would have interpreted Dix's portrait as a representation of the dealer exposed in the act of debasing the beautiful by commodifying the female body. It might even have been possible to connect the dealer represented by Dix to peddlers of what was called then in Germany dirt and trash, Schmutz und Schund, erotica and pulp fiction that became the target of censorship by law in 1926. In fact, in none of his other portraits of art dealers did Dix show them actually selling art. That's preserved for this painting. Hence, it seems plausible to understand Dix's painting as something coming perilously close, or you may think more than perilously close, to proposing or making possible the imagination of an identity between the pathology allegedly legible on the Jew's body and the widely feared Judaization of Germany. That is, the alleged victory of materialism and egotism over traditional moral standards and cultural values. Dix's oeuvre was filled with pictures of sex workers, you saw one before, to the disgust of many, including Flechtheim. They were totally repulsed by Dix's work. Yet it was the art dealer, this painting seems to have insinuated, who was the pimp or pornographer. So. In advancing such an argument, however, caution is warranted. It is important to keep in mind the fact that few German painters of the 1920s were Dix's equal in irony. Rarely was his work as straightforward and unequivocal as it might seem at first glance, as many leading critics, including Einstein, noted in the 1920s. Furthermore, we should not forget that Dix had made the Dadaist Pragerstrasse 5 years earlier, poking fun at political anti-Semitism by pasting in a legless veteran's right-wing flyer, which doubles not as a dog whistle, but a dog's bark. We should not forget Dix's Jewish friends and patrons, whose portraits by the painter were often, but not always, cherished by them, despite the painter's fixation on and play with tropes of Jewishness, especially in preparatory drawings and private caricatures. I mentioned the Star of David here, and I've written an article on this drawing here, looking at this, which is actually heavy graphite and erasure marks that produce a hole in the drawing, which I've talked about, given its location in the drawing, as a kind of working through the idea of what circumcision meant on the Jewish body. Simons was a Jewish lawyer, but Simons loved the painting. He took it with him into exile when then he left Germany after the Nazis rise to power. You can go see it in Montreal. It's really great. We should not forget that 8 years later, after being targeted by the new Nazi regime, Dix produced 2 drawings of dairymen, whose features are unremarkable, but whose inscribed names, Joseph and Ephraim, as I've argued elsewhere, could have quietly subverted Nazi ideology and policies. Such drawings, and this one was interestingly acquired by the National Gallery in 1935 and was never confiscated. Interesting. Such drawings may have been hints of the presence of a Jewish peasantry in the German countryside, which was almost unimaginable to Nazi anti-Semites. There's Jews saying, look, Jewish people are part of the German nation. They're part of the German countryside. They're Ephraim, right? Joseph. So we should not forget that Dix gave Flechtheim a drawing copied from the full-size cartoon of the painted portrait, excising the signs of cubism, cropping out the dealer's hands, and showing him not with a frown, but with a Mona Lisa-like smile. All of this complicates, to a certain degree, any analysis of Dix's portrait. It may serve as evidence that the painting did not simply, and I'm saying simply, all right, simply, it did reinscribe, but not simply reinscribe anti-Semitic tropes at Flechtheim's expense, but rather in its excess. Dix's work is so excessive, it often it denaturalizes what it represents so often. In its excess, ironizes the stereotypes it invokes, making viewers uncomfortably aware of their act of viewing, their act of understanding, and perhaps even of taking pleasure. It's so bad. Right? It's like Quentin Tarantino. It's so awful. Right? So, I used to call Dix the Quentin Tarantino of German painting in the 20s. It certainly indicates that Dix's relationships with Jewish Germans were numerous, and that his representations of them were varied, despite his use of stereotyping caricature. I'm very serious about the need for circumspection. If the pictorial material I have just mentioned complicates the picture, so does the fact that there is very little corroborating textual evidence. Dix wrote little and reportedly destroyed most of his correspondences with colleagues and friends to protect himself from the Nazis after 1933. However, there is one document that may support my explanation of the picture as a product of professional resentments that became linked to prevalent anti-Semitic discourses widespread in German society. It is Karl Nierendorf's letter to Dix of March 1924, which I quoted earlier. It's the one reporting Flechtheim's alleged derision of the painter's work, which takes us to an abject realm of the German language. There's this idea of the Germany land of poets and thinkers, Dichter und Denker. Well, we're not going there. The key word, as I've read this letter, and some have read it differently, is Forzenmaler, which has been translated in accordance with Nierendorf's later use of the word stink as somebody who did nothing but paint farts. Because the German word, a crude German word for, I can't believe I'm saying this in this gorgeous auditorium. But anyway, it's a scatological kind of issue. Dix was a soldier, he's working, there's all sorts of things going on here. But the correct spelling of that would have been different. In the letter, it's with an O, and the correct word is with a U. Yet thinking about Dix's numerous graphic and sometimes scandalous representations of women's bodies, one cannot help but ask if Flechtheim had used an extremely crude word for female genitalia, which is another way this term is usually translated, assuming that Nierendorf's account was accurate. Yet that misogynistic word is not what is spelled and underscored by Nierendorf in his letter. It seems highly unlikely that the dealer, who was a precise correspondent, would have made a spelling error at precisely that point. And hence it seems plausible to suggest that the word Forzenmaler, which is found in no German dictionary, was not only meant to refer to one crude expression or another, but also to indicate an accent. It might have indicated that Flechtheim spoke German with a difference. Dix was a polarizing figure in the 1920s. He was widely admired on the left, hated by many on the right. He would quickly be marginalized after Hitler's rise to power in 1933. Yet this textual evidence, if my analysis is correct, suggests that Nierendorf and Dix, regardless of what was to come a few years later, were not entirely immune to the common notion of the mumbling, mauschelnde Jew, contributing with his cosmopolitan intellect, materialist spirit, and disturbing sexuality to Germany's modern decline. How am I doing for time? Is it okay? Or do I need to stop? Do I need to stop? Would you like me to stop after all of this? My wife always yells at me. She's like, you work on George Gross's pictures of Nazi torture, and you work on, you're like, why don't you work on something nice? So I think I have a few minutes left. So what I want to do, having now suggested that this painting is a product of a kind of personal antagonism that becomes linked to wide ideas, that's a kind of granular, I wanted to pull it out. Right, this kind of expression it's ugly, but it has kind of reasons. Now what I want to do in the talk is move to a different axis of Dix's and other artists' resentments of the art market in general. But a lot of people are leaving. So what I'm going to do, is I'm going to summarize. Because I think it's been a long morning, and you're all getting tired. And I think I need to wrap it up before you say, oh my God, Van Dyke, what a guy. So again, I have a few pages of manuscript here where I want to move away from the Flechtheim portrait and think about Dix's other representations of dealers, including his own. This is his own dealer, Nierendorf. This is his own dealer, Nierendorf. This is a museum director and art critic, Paul Schmidt, a very strong supporter of Dix. This is another dealer, Günter Franke. And he makes fun of everybody. Again, he's ruthless, right? So he's ruthless. So what I want to suggest is that the Flechtheim portrait is what I've just been talking about, but it's also something else. It's part of a structural resentment by many artists of the art market in general, which they felt was exploitative. Right? Dix writes letters. I'll read you this letter. And so I want to kind of think about this painting in various ways. Right? Here's one expression of Dix's resentment, and forgive the language, this is Dix talking, not me. It's a goddamn load of crap, he's writing to his dealer, that you, although you promised it, have not sent me up with a line of credit. I have no desire to constantly break my fingers writing until you can spare me 2 marks. I don't want to wait anymore, I want my money. You are slowly turning into what they call a capitalist art dealer. You seem to be so art dealered that you don't understand anything anymore. I'm fed up. That's not a letter to Flechtheim, that's a letter to his own supporter, Nierendorf. This is the outraged language of the mutinous front soldier, of the rebellious worker. As letters like this attest, Dix believed that men like Flechtheim and Karl Einstein were not his only problems. So it was Nierendorf, his main guy in the market. Given Dix's constant, comprehensive mistrust of dealers and his fear of betrayal and exploitation, it comes as no surprise that he voided his contract with Nierendorf as soon as he could after his appointment to a professorship in Dresden. Made at least temporarily independent of the free market by his new position as professor with a 7-year contract, he took his leave of all dealers as soon as he could. So there's a different kind of argument. Now, I have come to my end by skipping about 4 pages. So. Right, you're like, thank you, right? I've come to an end. As much recent scholarship has pointed out, Otto Dix was a complex painter and character, an ambivalent figure, if there ever was one, in Weimar Germany's modern artistic culture. Though no Marcel Duchamp or Claude Cahun, no Andy Warhol or Cindy Sherman, he seems to have performatively produced an artistic identity that refused or blurred usual categories and oppositions. He postured as a proletarian and as a dandy, yet sought the comforts of bourgeois life. He was an opponent of Prussian militarism, of the herd produced by army discipline, yet seems to have shared aspects of the right's conception of an armored, soldierly masculinity. His pictures were, for the most part, both exquisite and repellent. He was an erotomaniacal lover of women, yet depicted himself as their brutal murderer. He was an avant-garde, Nietzschean painter of tragic images, yet as an academy professor accepted an autonomy underwritten by the state. He was a radical who refused partisan commitment. Is that right? It's hard to pin him down. Looking at this troubling portrait of Alfred Flechtheim, here's my final word for today. Dix was an extraordinarily talented, unusually successful artist who resented the market that served him much better than most German artists of the day, the umbilical cord of gold to which the modernist culture was always tied. He was an intensely competitive survivor who reacted sharply to perceived threats to his professional ambitions. He was a contradictory anti-capitalist social critic, an infuriating provocateur, an entertaining fool, a deadly serious virtuoso of giving offense, and boy, did he give a lot of people offense in the 1920s. Dix was no Nazi, to be sure, to be absolutely clear. But there's no getting around this painting's insinuation of common anti-Semitic tropes into its portrayal of a Jewish antagonist. However, my point today is not to suggest that Dix shared the radical, racist, murderous worldview of National Socialism. It's not a gotcha that I'm after. It was Franz Radziwiłł who joined the Nazi Party in 1933, the subject of my other book. Emil Nolde, fan favorite after 1945, was a far more robust anti-Semite, as a major exhibition in Germany showed a few years ago, once the archive was opened. The point of today's talk is instead to remind ourselves of how pervasive and ordinary such horrible ideas were in Germany at the time, how they even percolate up into the center of the modern art world. It is to suggest that what we have here is not the sign of an unequivocal politics, but rather the messy, misguided, mistaken material of ideological and social critique in the making. This picture materializes the desperation, tensions, and contradictions of artistic life and labor in a time of crisis. It testifies to German art's fraught modern history in all of its brilliance, its beauty, and its horror. Thank you very much.